So picture this. It is January 1985.
Cool.
You are standing in this just beautifully appointed corner office
Right.
at the United Nations in New York.
A very nice place to be.
Right. And you look out these massive floor-to-ceiling windows, and like 3 stories below, there's the UN Rose Garden.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 1,500 rose bushes just in full bloom. It's this incredibly manicured tapestry of, red, yellow, pink, white.
Very pristine.
Exactly. And beyond that, First Avenue is just bustling. People are grabbing hot dogs from vendor carts. Umbrellas are popping open because there's this light, freezing drizzle starting to fall over the city.
Typical New York winter.
Yeah, exactly. But inside that highly heated, super quiet office sits Dr. Mahendra Shah.
Right.
He is the newly appointed Director of Information for the United Nations Office of Emergency Operations in Africa.
Which is a massive role.
Huge. And on his massive mahogany desk, right in the middle of these neat little stacks of official, highly sensitive correspondence from global dignitaries, there is this slightly crumpled tan envelope.
A tan envelope.
Yeah. And it has a colorful stamp from India on it.
Okay.
So he opens it up, and out bounce these little raw grains of rice.
Oh, wow.
Just scattering across the polished wood of his desk. He gently gathers them up into a small pile, and he reads the note inside.
What does it say?
It's written in this shaky, childlike Devanagari script.
Yeah.
And it translates to, my family doesn't have very much, so I'm sending half my dinner. Please give it to the children who don't have any food.
Man. That is just, it's an arresting image.
It really is.
And it perfectly encapsulates this impossible paradox he was facing at the time. Because Mahendra was, above all things, a man of systems and mathematics.
Right.
He knew instantly, looking at that desk, that 50 times that amount of rice wouldn't provide enough caloric energy to save even one starving child in the sub-Saharan famine he was tasked with fighting.
Yeah, logically, mathematically, it's nothing.
Exactly. Logistically, it is a literal drop in an ocean of unimaginable continent-wide need. But philosophically, emotionally, that envelope is everything.
It's everything. So
it represents the absolute pure, innate humanity that we are all just, endowed with at birth. It's that raw instinct to care, to sacrifice.
To share when you see someone else in pain.
Right. And for Mahendra, staring at those few grains of rice in an office surrounded by billions of dollars of global wealth and, frankly, political gridlock.
Oh, so much gridlock.
It crystallized a question that would ultimately define his entire life. Like, why is the innate, beautiful humanity so quickly forgotten by the world as we grow up and build our institutions?
I mean, just imagine the heavy, suffocating weight of that exact moment for you, sitting there. You know the sheer impossibility of the logistics. You know the death toll is literally rising by the hour, but you are being confronted by the undeniable purity of a child's gesture from halfway across the world.
It's a profound tension.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that profound tension is exactly what we are exploring in today's deep dive.
Yes.
Our mission today is to explore the life, the deeply rooted philosophy, and the relentless world-changing efforts of Dr. Mahendra M. Shah.
He's a fascinating subject.
He is. He's someone who has been described in our source material by people who know his work as this incredibly unique, almost impossible blend of people.
Right, like Mahatma Gandhi's spiritual nonviolence.
Exactly. Combined with Rachel Carson's environmental foresight.
And Norman Borlaug's agricultural genius.
And then throw in his own mentor, Maurice Strong's, just sheer bureaucratic willpower.
Which is quite the combination. And we aren't just doing a standard chronological biography today for you all listening. We are examining what is essentially a blueprint for global survival.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
We are going to explore how one man utilized incredibly complex mathematical modeling, a deeply ingrained spiritual philosophy, and just sheer unadulterated willpower to fight famine, shape global environmental policy, and ultimately try to redefine what it actually means to live sustainably on this planet.
Right. It is a story about the violent clash between human compassion and institutional ego.
And how one man tried to build a bridge between the two.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because before we can really understand how Mahendra navigated the absolute cutthroat, labyrinthine world of global bureaucracy and international politics, we have to understand the why.
The foundation.
Exactly. Why did he care so deeply when so many others in his position just treated it as, a bureaucratic job?
Just pushing papers.
Right. So to do that, we have to look at his roots. We have to look at his heritage.
Okay.
He was born to Indian parents, his father Manikchand, and his mother Morben.
And they originally grew up in this tiny Indian village called Baraja, right?
Yeah, Baraja. It's situated right on the banks of the Nigmati River in the Kutch district of Gujarat.
Before they eventually moved to Kenya, which is where Mahendra grew up.
Right. So what was it about that specific upbringing that wired him this way?
Well, Baraja is absolutely foundational to everything he later built. It wasn't just a quaint little backdrop. It was a living, breathing, philosophical ecosystem.
How so?
The village had a population of barely 300 people, and more than half of them practiced Jainism.
Jainism. Okay.
Yeah, which is one of the world's oldest religions, and its primary, absolute core tenet is ahimsa.
Which translates to nonviolence to all life forms, right?
Exactly. But we have to understand, this isn't just some vague, poetic concept of peace and love.
Like a bumper sticker.
Right, no. In Baraja, this was a strict, highly regulated philosophy of sustainable living. The entire community operates on a principle of doing zero harm.
So they're strict vegetarians.
Yes, but it goes way further than that. The village elders and the temple priests literally wear fabric masks over their mouths.
Wait, like surgical masks?
Sort of, yeah. But not for their own health. They wear them to avoid accidentally inhaling and killing microscopic germs or flying insects.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly specific.
It is. And the destruction of plant life is strictly forbidden unless it's absolutely necessary for survival. They completely refuse the use of plastics. It is a complete, total integration of respect for the natural world into the very mundane actions of daily life.
The stories from his childhood really illustrate how deeply this was ingrained in him, too. Like, his mother, Morbin, would take him on these long walks to the Kenyan landscape where they eventually lived.
Right.
And she would constantly reinforce this idea that every life is precious no matter how small. If they saw an insect on the path, they literally stepped around it.
Which takes a lot of mindfulness.
Exactly. She taught him the other core tenets of Jainism, too. Absolute honesty, not stealing, sexual continence, and non-possessiveness.
Meaning you don't hoard what you don't actually need.
Right. And then there's his father, Mahendra. He kept a diary every single night reflecting on his actions. And he really instilled in Mahendra this profound sense of interpersonal respect.
There's that one story about marriage that I think perfectly captures this mindset.
Oh, the divorce story.
Yeah.
So Mahendra asked his father why there are hardly any divorces in Jain villages.
Yeah.
And his father simply says, marriage is about respect. He explains that if a couple hits a wall and really wants to split up, they are required to go before the village council.
Which is comprised of the absolute eldest men in the village.
Right. And his mother chimes in during this conversation and says, he means really, really old men who, at their advanced age, are often completely hard of hearing.
That's amazing.
So you have this frustrated couple stating their case, airing all their grievances to this council of elders that can barely hear a single word they're saying.
And the council, almost universally, just looks at them and tells the couple to go home and try to start anew.
Just go home, try again.
Because they couldn't hear the complaints anyway. But because the word of the council is considered sacred in that culture, the couple usually just goes home and works it out, avoiding the taboo of divorce entirely.
It's a very funny, very human story. But the underlying message is incredibly profound, you know. You commit, you respect each other, and you do the hard work of fixing things.
You don't just throw things away when they get difficult.
Exactly. And that applies to a marriage, it applies to an animal's life, and it applies to the environment.
And if we look at Jainism through the lens of a systems analyst, which is exactly what Mahendra went to Cambridge to become, it isn't just a localized religious practice.
What do you mean?
It is a highly functional, highly resilient framework for a sustainable ecosystem. It is an ancient acknowledgement that every single input and output in an environment deeply affects everything else.
Right. The mask to protect the insect, the refusal to use plastics, the commitment to non-possessiveness.
Yeah, these are micro behaviors. But
Yeah.
when you scale those micro behaviors up to a societal level, they are exactly the behaviors that prevent climate change, prevent resource depletion, and prevent gross economic inequality.
So Mahendra's genius was that he took the ancient, localized wisdom of his parents and eventually translated it into the modern mathematical language of global environmentalism and data science.
Yeah, exactly.
I see the connection, but this is where I really have to wonder about the psychological toll of that transition. Well, it's one thing to practice absolute nonviolence and deep empathy in a quiet, tight-knit village, or on a peaceful walk with your mother through a Kenyan forest.
Sure.
But how does that delicate philosophy survive when you are suddenly dropped into the brutal, self-interested, highly bureaucratic reality of global politics?
It's a huge culture shock.
It seems to me that operating on ahimsa in the middle of the Cold War geopolitics of the 1980s is an incredibly fast track to getting crushed by institutional greed.
And that tension you are identifying is the crucible of his entire career. He had to figure out how to armor his empathy with hard, undeniable data.
Right.
And the ultimate test of that, the event that truly forged his methodology, was the apocalyptic horror of the 1984 to 1985 African famine.
Which was just devastating.
To set the stage for how jarring this transition was, we have to look at a pivotal meeting in November 1984.
Okay.
It takes place at the Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva, Switzerland. The setting itself is almost a grotesque contrast to the reality he is about to face.
How opulent are we talking?
It's a massive grand ballroom, 5-meter-high ceilings, bathed in glowing blue lights to match the UN logo. You have international dignitaries in tailored suits eating caviar-topped hors d'oeuvres and drinking wildly expensive wine.
And Mahendra is there.
Yes, at the firm insistence of his mentor, Maurice Strong.
Maurice Strong is a fascinating figure in his own right, by the way.
Right.
He's a man who had this legendary reputation within the UN for just bulldozing through bureaucracy to get things done.
Oh, absolutely. And Strong introduces Mahendra to Bradford Morse, who was the administrator of the UN Development Program at the time.
Okay.
And they essentially ambush Mahendra right there in the ballroom. Morse starts loudly talking about how thrilled they all are that Mahendra has agreed to head up the information department of the newly formed UN Office for Emergency Operations in Africa, or UNOEOA.
Wait, but hadn't Mahendra already declined the job?
He had. He was completely stunned because he had already explicitly told Maurice he couldn't take the job due to his other academic commitments.
Wow. Talk about a public trap.
Right. But before Mahendra can politely decline again, Strong and Morse literally physically guide him across the ballroom to a group of men surrounded by a wall of Secret Service agents.
And who is standing in the middle of that circle?
Standing right in the center is George H.W. Bush, who was the Vice President of the United States at the time.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Bush had just returned from a harrowing fact-finding mission in Sudan. He looks directly at Mahendra, shakes his hand, and says, "Ah, the Cambridge man from Kenya. It's a pleasure to meet you. Good to have you on board."
He had no way out.
None. Bush then leans in and tells Mahendra with absolute grave concern that millions of people are actively dying in Ethiopia and Sudan, and they need his system's expertise to stop it.
So at that exact moment, with the Vice President of the United States welcoming him to the team and invoking the lives of millions, Mahendra realizes his destiny has been completely decided for him.
He cannot walk away from this horror. He has to weaponize his data for human survival.
And when we say horror, we mean something truly biblical in scale. By 1984, northern Ethiopia had been experiencing its absolute worst drought in centuries.
Well, the drought was only half the story, right?
Exactly. This was largely a man-made famine. The natural disaster was being brutally exacerbated by fierce border fighting, internal armed insurgency, and a highly corrupt government.
A government that was actively siphoning off international aid to feed its military while letting its own citizens starve?
Yeah. And for 2 long years, the world barely paid attention. It wasn't until October 1984 when a BBC reporter named Michael Burke and a brilliant Kenyan photographer named Mohammed Amin essentially forced 2 highly skeptical aid pilots to slide them into a restricted makeshift refugee camp in Korem, Ethiopia.
And what they filmed there? The broadcast of 40,000 starving people, skeletal infants, and mothers too emaciated to weep. That BBC report shocked the global conscience.
It was the catalyst that eventually sparked the massive We Are the World and Live Aid movements, which resulted in a staggering influx of public donations.
But this is where Mahendra's specific genius becomes critical.
Because money alone isn't enough.
Right. As a systems analyst, Mahendra knew that ending a tragedy of that magnitude takes far more than just throwing a massive pile of money at the continent.
You need a plan.
Exactly. Before Mahendra implemented his systems approach, international aid was often a purely emotional, incredibly chaotic reaction.
Just throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah. You had hundreds of different NGOs, various donor governments, and private citizens all trying to help simultaneously. But without a centralized, data-driven nervous system to coordinate them, the aid was useless.
Like pallets of food would just sit rotting on sun-baked runways because there were no trucks to move them.
Or medical supplies would be sent to regions that actually needed water. or shipments would be easily intercepted by local warlords because the routes weren't tracked.
So Mahendra's revolutionary approach was to take the raw, chaotic compassion of the world and engineer it into precise logistics.
His task was to build an integrated, time-sensitive information system from scratch in an era before the modern internet.
Right, let's talk about the how here, because the logistics of this in 1984 are mind-boggling.
They really are.
He wasn't just managing a bank account. He and his team had to track the real-time status of 35 different sub-Saharan countries.
And they were doing this via daily telexes, faxes, and crackling radio reports from the ground.
Tracking meteorological weather conditions, the massive movements of displaced populations walking across deserts, specific medical needs, down to the vial of vaccines.
The physical logistics for road and air access, shelter capacities, and the shifting lines of the ongoing armed conflicts.
And they had to take all of that disjointed, terrifying data from ground sources, media outlets, and reluctant governments, synthesize it, and release a comprehensive public report on the 28th of every single month, without fail.
The reason that strict 28th of the month deadline was so vital comes down to one word.
Trust. Trust from the donors.
Right. Yes. Before Mahendra built this system, donor nations were incredibly hesitant to release their pledged funds. They didn't want to send hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into what they perceived as a black hole of African corruption and logistical failure.
Which is somewhat understandable given the history.
Right. But by providing undeniable, highly transparent, and hyper-detailed data, Mahendra forced their hand.
Because they couldn't claim ignorance anymore.
Exactly. When governmental agencies and massive NGOs saw the absolute credibility and granularity of his monthly information, when they could see exactly which road a truck would take and which village it would reach, they began releasing funds rapidly.
Often within a week of receiving his reports.
He essentially engineered a massive continent-wide plumbing system where the empathy and wealth of the world could actually flow directly to the people who needed it most, entirely bypassing the usual corrupt inefficiencies.
But he didn't just sit in an office in New York looking at faxes all day. To really understand what his data meant on the ground, he had to see it.
Right. In June 1985, Mahendra took a trip to that same camp in Coram, Ethiopia.
And he flies in on this loud, rattling cargo helicopter.
And the pilot flying him in is this deeply cynical, hardened guy. He flat out tells Mahendra over the headsets that he distrusts UN diplomats because they always show up, take photos, make grand promises, and then leave without actually changing anything.
That's brutal, but probably pretty accurate to what he'd seen.
Yeah. And when they finally land and the helicopter doors open, the sensory details Mahendra experiences are just harrowing.
According to the sources, there is an acidic, overwhelming stench of human death and dysentery so strong that Mahendra can barely force himself to breathe.
There are thousands upon thousands of skeletal people pressing themselves against the chain-link fence of the camp, just begging with their eyes.
And inside the stifling heat of the medical tent, it is so severely overcrowded that there is no time for actual examinations.
A doctor is simply walking down the rows of bodies, quickly feeling for pulses. And for those who are deemed too far gone to survive, he takes out a simple felt-tip pen and draws a black cross on their neck.
Oh, man. That cross is a triage marker.
Yes, meaning they will not receive the incredibly scarce food or medicine. They are marked to simply be allowed to die.
It is a profound, almost shattering moral injury for a man raised on ahimsa to witness that level of normalized suffering.
And it leads to a specific moment in the camp that deeply challenged his entire philosophical framework.
What happens?
As he is walking through the massive, desperate crowd with Aaron Brine, who is the UN representative managing the camp, a severely emaciated mother approaches him.
Okay.
She is holding the hand of a 5-year-old boy whose legs are literally as thin as pencils. Mahendra, driven by that exact same innate human compassion we talked about with the grains of rice, reaches into his bag.
Nice.
He pulls out his own brown lunchbox, a simple meal that the cynical helicopter pilot had given him earlier, and he hands it directly to the starving mother.
I mean, how could you not?
The woman immediately drops to her knees in the dirt in sheer gratitude, and the little boy wraps his arms around Mahendra's leg.
Wow.
But before the emotional weight of the moment can even settle, Brian violently grabs Mahendra by the arm, pulls him aside, and sharply tells him to stop.
Because of a riot.
Yes. Brian says, "I know you meant well, but please do not ever do that again. If the rest of the crowd sees that you have food, there will be a riot. People will be trampled to death for a single bowl of rice."
Can you even imagine the mental and spiritual toll that takes on a person? You have the physical power right there in your hands to feed the dying child standing immediately in front of you.
But doing so might trigger a chaotic riot that kills dozens of other starving people.
It is the ultimate tragic conflict between individual humanitarianism, his deep Jain belief in the infinite value of the single life standing in front of him, and the cold, utilitarian, mathematical calculus required to manage a disaster zone.
When should active benevolence take precedence over the collective good? It's a question with no right answer.
No, there really isn't. And to survive that kind of relentless cognitive dissonance and emotional trauma without becoming entirely cynical or broken, a person requires a massive psychological anchor.
For Mahendra, that anchor was his family.
Yeah, he constantly grounded himself in his deep love and respect for his wife, RT, and his children, Jaideep, Pitapali, Rajini, and Kashini.
Knowing he had that unshakable foundation of love at home allowed him to compartmentalize the horrors he was mapping in his data models.
It allowed him to keep his heart open while his mind pushed the global bureaucracy to move faster, to optimize the supply chains to save more lives.
And his relentless data system worked. Millions of lives were demonstrably saved because his transparent data forced the disparate nations of the world to act in a coordinated, effective way.
Africa proved that the world could care. It proved that the global community could mobilize effectively if they were given the right transparent framework and the right emotional catalyst.
But as we move forward to his next major mission, the narrative takes a much darker turn.
Yeah, it proved that global empathy is tragically highly selective.
Yes. We move chronologically to 1988. A historic, incredibly fragile peace agreement has just been signed regarding Afghanistan, anticipating the final withdrawal of the occupying Soviet troops.
And the country is in absolute ruins.
Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, who is a highly respected global humanitarian, is put in charge of the newly formed UN Office of the Coordinator for Afghanistan, or UNOCA.
And knowing of the massive success in Africa, the prince specifically recruits Mahendra to be his director of planning.
The situation Mahendra walks into is dire, almost beyond comprehension. I mean, over 50% of the entire population of Afghanistan is displaced.
Half the country.
Half. Millions are living in sprawling, desperate refugee camps across the borders in neighboring Pakistan and Iran, putting massive destabilizing pressure on those countries.
And internally, the infrastructure, the water systems, and the agricultural sectors are completely devastated by years of relentless bombing.
So Mahendra goes in totally ready to apply the highly successful, data-driven Africa model to this new crisis.
Right. He and his team, working closely with a brilliant colleague named Francesco Strapoli, create this incredibly sophisticated mathematical system called the Zones of Tranquility model.
And what did that model actually do?
Well, they didn't just look at a map and guess where to send the concrete and the grain. They used hard, multi-layered data to compare the exact ratio of displaced people currently living in the Iranian and Pakistani camps against the remaining population in each of Afghanistan's 34 distinct provinces.
That's very granular.
Very. But they went deeper. They overlaid that demographic data with specific social, environmental, agricultural, and economic viability metrics to pinpoint the exact optimal tranquil areas inside Afghanistan.
The goal being to find the specific regions where targeted rebuilding of schools, wells, and farms would encourage the highest possible number of refugees to return home safely and sustainably.
It was frankly an absolute masterpiece of systems analysis.
From a purely mathematical and planning perspective, it was the perfect roadmap for national recovery. Prince Sadruddin loved it.
The international press reviewed the plan and praised it highly. It offered a clear, actionable path out of the chaos.
But here is the devastating geopolitical reality. Unlike the famine in Africa, there was no visceral BBC report of starving children that shocked the conscience of the Western public.
Right. There was no We Are the World concert raising millions for Afghan farmers. There was no massive, sustained public outcry forcing politicians to open their treasuries.
And without that intense emotional public pressure holding their feet to the fire, the cynical geopolitical self-interest of the superpowers just took over completely.
Western countries and the Soviets had made all these grand, highly publicized financial pledges to UNOTOCA during the peace talks.
But as localized fighting escalated among various armed factions, including the early iterations of what would eventually become the Taliban, those pledges vanished.
The funding was just quietly pulled.
For instance, a critical $6 million pledge promised by the Soviets for agricultural recovery simply never materialized. Mahendra came to this harsh, bitter realization that the global superpowers were far more interested in covertly selling small arms, artillery, and military equipment to the various warring factions than they were in funding humanitarian aid, planting crops, or rebuilding schools.
So the ongoing tragedy was a direct result of the uncontrolled, highly profitable sale of arms by multiple nations.
Exactly. Nations who were putting their own economic and strategic self-interest far ahead of the survival of the Afghan people.
This period marks a profound shift in his philosophical understanding of how the world works, doesn't it?
It highlights the absolute tragic limits of data.
Yeah. You can build the most elegant, mathematically perfect, foolproof model for national recovery. You can hand them the exact blueprints for the zones of tranquility. But if the political will doesn't exist, if institutional greed and the military-industrial complex overpower basic human compassion, your model is entirely useless.
It will just sit in a binder on a desk in Geneva.
Which is just so depressing. He realized that top-down systemic change is constantly actively threatened by the self-interest of those currently holding power.
Which really makes you wonder, how did this realization not just completely break him?
Right. He's a man driven by ahimsa, by a belief in nonviolence, and he's forced to sit in rooms and watch the world knowingly, willingly fund violence and destabilization over starvation and recovery.
You would think he would just walk away in disgust.
But instead of quitting, he pivoted his entire strategy. He realized that constantly reacting to the horrific aftermath of disasters like famine and proxy wars wasn't enough. He needed to go further upstream.
He needed to address the root causes of these disasters, which he identified as wildly unsustainable global environmental and developmental policies.
He realized that to fix the root cause of the suffering, he had to help write the actual rulebook for the future of the planet.
And that strategic pivot leads us directly to 1992 and what is arguably his most intellectually demanding, high-stakes mission.
Okay, let's get into it.
His old mentor, Maurice Strong, recruits him once again, this time to serve a critical role for UNCED, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development.
Which history remembers as the monumental Rio Earth Summit.
Exactly. Strong tasked Mahendra with an objective that sounds simple but is practically impossible: synthesizing global environmental policy into a single workable document.
The task is almost comical in its sheer bureaucratic impossibility. Strong literally hands Mahendra over 600 heavily redacted, deeply negotiated, incredibly dense pages of preparatory committee or PREPCOM reports.
And these aren't just scientific papers?
No. They contain the highly contested, often totally contradictory demands, grievances, and economic agreements of 178 wildly different nations.
And Strong essentially looks at him and says, the world leaders flying into Rio are not going to read 600 pages of arguing. I need you to use your systems analysis skills to distill all of this chaos into a 100-page actionable, systemic summary.
And the kicker. Oh, and you have to present your finalized strategy to our senior staff in exactly 3 days.
3 days. It is a Herculean intellectual task. But this is exactly where Mahendra's rigorous Cambridge training in systems thinking shines brighter than ever.
He knew that you cannot just write a traditional executive summary that says, Chapter 1, water, Chapter 2, forests.
Right. He didn't summarize. He mapped the invisible interlinkages. He created the foundational framework for what would become known as Agenda 21 by mathematically and logically showing exactly how environmental degradation, economic development, crushing poverty, human health, and governmental policy are all inextricably linked.
He organized the chaos into 4 broad core systems and 7 highly specific operational subsystems.
He proved on paper that you cannot possibly have a meaningful conversation about agricultural yields without simultaneously talking about local water supply.
Which directly affects rural poverty.
Which immediately dictates human health outcomes.
Which ultimately drives the stability of the global economy. Everything is a single breathing organism.
I think the best way to visualize what he did is an analogy.
Oh, like a symphony. Imagine 178 different people all locked in a massive, echoing concert hall.
Okay, I can picture that.
Every single person is playing a different instrument, and they are all aggressively playing their own specific song as loudly as possible.
Just a wall of noise.
Exactly. The small island nations are banging the drums about rising sea levels, wiping them off the map. The developing nations are blaring the trumpets about the need to industrialize to escape crushing poverty.
And the wealthy industrialized nations are playing the strings, demanding sustained economic growth and patent protection.
It is just deafening, discordant noise. Mahendra's job in those 3 days wasn't to tell anyone to stop playing.
Right.
His job was to listen to the underlying frequencies of all that noise, map the chords, and compose a master symphony that allowed every single country to play together in harmony.
He had to show them that their individual problems were actually just different notes in the exact same song of global survival.
That is the monumental task of Agenda 21. And within that grand symphony, Mahendra vigorously championed a critical, highly controversial concept that was fiercely debated in the halls of Rio: common but differential responsibility.
We must break down exactly how this math works because it remains the absolute crux of every modern climate negotiation today.
Yeah, let's lay it out.
In 1992, the data showed an undeniable, glaring inequity. Developed, industrialized nations represented roughly 1/5 of the total global population, yet they historically accounted for a staggering 4/5 of all global pollution.
The United States alone, possessing under 5% of the world's population at the time, was producing nearly 24% of all global carbon emissions.
Right. And Mahendra's point, the entire ethical foundation of this principle, is that rich, industrialized nations built their massive modern wealth over a century by using incredibly cheap, dirty, highly polluting technologies like unregulated coal and oil.
They are the ones who pumped the carbon into the atmosphere. They created the crisis.
Therefore, they cannot now turn around, pull up the ladder, and force developing nations who are just desperately trying to build electrical grids to lift their people out of starvation to halt their own economic development just to save the environment.
The responsibility to fix the planet is common to everyone, but the burden is differentiated.
The rich nations must freely share their newly developed clean technology, and they must carry the vast majority of the financial burden to help the poorer nations develop sustainably.
You simply cannot look at a country whose people are starving and demand they worry about their carbon footprint while you are driving a gas-guzzling SUV to a fully stocked supermarket.
Precisely. And Mahendra delivered a fiery, uncharacteristically blunt speech at the Global Forum in Rio that drove this ethical point home.
And fascinatingly, he bypassed the politicians in the room entirely to do it.
He stood at the podium and challenged the audience directly. He noted that the UN constantly talks about empowering women and youth to change the world, but he asked, who exactly are we?
Are we, the political elites and corporate CEOs who make up the vast majority of decision makers, but who routinely act only in their own short-term financial self-interest?
He insisted that true change will never come from the podiums. He declared that the public, the youth, the mothers, the everyday citizens must become the actual change makers.
They must force terrified governments and greedy businesses to act sustainably by using two highly potent weapons: the power of their thumb to vote and the power of their wallet to consume.
Writing the rules of Agenda 21 was a monumental triumph. It literally set the stage for all global sustainability efforts that followed.
But, as Mahendra soon found out, writing a brilliant set of rules is one thing. Forcing entrenched institutions to actually play by them reveals the deep-seated egos and silos within the very organizations that are meant to save us.
Here is where the story gets really interesting, as we move into his relentless, exhausting battle against institutional ego.
Yeah, following Rio, he dedicated himself to building the actual mechanisms to enforce these ideas.
He did extensive, highly technical work with massive organizations like IESA, which is the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis.
Also the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization.
And the CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. At IESA and FAO, he was the driving force in developing the Agroecological Zone, or AEZ, and the World Food System, WFS, models.
We need to understand how revolutionary these models were. They didn't just look at farming historically, they mathematically mapped the future of agriculture.
The AEZ model took hyper-specific data on soil composition, historical weather patterns, terrain slopes, and water availability for every grid square on Earth.
And matched it against the biological needs of hundreds of different crop varieties.
It could scientifically determine that a specific drought-resistant strain of potato could double the caloric output of a specific valley in Peru.
Or that a certain flood-resistant rice variety was perfectly optimal for a specific region in the Philippines.
It was about maximizing global food yield while mathematically minimizing the required water and chemical fertilizer.
It is brilliant. It is literally taking the guesswork and the risk out of global agriculture to ensure no one goes hungry.
So, armed with this incredible technology, he goes to CGIAR, which is a massive World Bank-funded project tasked with creating a unified food security systems model.
He realizes that to truly fight global food insecurity, you need centralized, rapid information sharing governance.
So he proposes this unified system to the 16 different highly specialized agricultural research centers scattered around the world.
And what happens? He hits a massive, unyielding brick wall.
The scientists and directors at these 16 centers are undeniably brilliant, but they operate in absolute jealous silos.
They want to protect their own specific fiefdoms, their own localized funding streams from donors, and their own administrative control.
They outright refuse to pool their data or share their resources for the collective good of the overarching model.
It is the ultimate infuriating tragedy of human ego superseding human survival.
And Mahendra saw the brutal, real-world consequences of this fragmented, selfish thinking play out in real time.
One of the clearest examples is his prophetic warnings about climate change and biofuels.
Right. At the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, and again forcefully in 2008, he practically begged the global community to look at the systemic data.
At the time, many wealthy developed nations were enthusiastically mandating massive biofuel production, turning crops like corn into ethanol for cars as a magic cure-all for reducing their carbon emissions.
But Mahendra looked at the AEZ models and saw the terrifying systemic ripple effect.
He realized that rich countries heavily subsidizing biofuels would cause massive, vital tracts of agricultural land in the developing world to be rapidly diverted by farmers.
Diverted from growing food to feed people to growing fuel to feed European and American cars.
Because the European and American energy markets pay far better than the local food markets.
Which means the overall supply of edible food drops dramatically and the basic prices skyrocket.
So in this incredibly tragic, ironic attempt for rich countries to feel green and environmentally friendly about their driving habits, they were literally pricing the absolute poorest nations on Earth out of being able to afford a basic bowl of grain.
It is a devastating systemic failure caused by looking at one small piece of the puzzle instead of the whole system.
Mahendra observed all of this. The petty silos at CGIAR, the massive blind spot regarding biofuels, the constant political gridlock, and he had this profound realization about human nature.
He reflected on the famous quote often attributed to Einstein. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
And Mahendra, exhausted by the bureaucracy, added his own addendum. So is ego, arrogance, and greed.
Think about your own life for a second, listeners. Have you ever worked in a massive corporation where different departments fiercely refuse to share critical information with each other just so their specific manager can look better to the CEO?
Where protecting your own little slice of the budget pie is deemed more important than the actual success of the whole company.
We have all dealt with that kind of petty office politics.
Now imagine that exact same petty ego. But the consequence isn't a missed quarterly sales target. The consequence is millions of people starving to death and the irreversible collapse of the global ecosystem.
That is the maddening reality Mahendra was fighting against every single day in these boardrooms.
And that level of continuous grinding friction against human ego eventually forces a breaking point, or rather, a profound philosophical pivot.
Deeply frustrated by the endless gridlock of governments, massive corporations, and academic silos, Mahendra realizes that trying to force the world to save itself from the top, down through UN mandates and World Bank directives, is fundamentally failing.
He needs an entirely new approach to human survival.
Which brings us to the ultimate climax of his philosophical journey. After decades of fighting these massive, high-stakes policy battles in the polished halls of New York, Geneva, and Vienna, he experiences a quiet revelation.
A few days after yet another exhausting conference, he is sitting on a beautiful, quiet beach in Bali with his son Jaydev.
They are just sitting there, listening to the gentle, rhythmic sounds of the ocean waves crashing against the sand, and Mahendra finally verbalizes an epiphany that had been building for years.
He turns and says, "There can be no sustainable development until human beings learn to live sustainably."
It is a simple sentence, but it upends his entire previous methodology. It answers the question he had been struggling with. If the UN, the World Bank, the politicians, and the massive scientific institutions cannot save us because they are paralyzed by their own self-interest and ego, who can?
Mahendra's answer, formulated on that beach with his son, is that we have to save ourselves, one by one.
The individual human being must become physically, mentally, and spiritually green before the global systems can ever become green.
You cannot possibly legislate a healthy, functioning planet if the individual humans populating it are deeply unwell.
So he takes a massive, courageous leap. In 2009, he makes the decision to step away from the toxic political environment of global bureaucracy.
He actually submits a highly principled resignation from IASA, specifically to protect his own academic integrity and freedom against increasing political manipulation.
He leaves that world of suits and summits behind, and he founds Zen Resort Bali.
But we have to be absolutely clear here. This isn't just a tired bureaucrat retiring to run a lucrative luxury hotel on a beach.
No, Zen Resort was built as a living, breathing laboratory for a revolutionary concept he calls sustainocracy.
It is meticulously designed to cure the pervasive diseases of what he calls modern lifestyles, the chronic stress, the highly processed poor diets, the absolute tragic detachment from the natural world that drives our rampant destructive consumerism.
He recognized that the modern, hyper-accelerated lifestyle, which is driven almost entirely by materialism and speed, is the actual root cause of the environmental crisis.
When people are physically exhausted and spiritually depleted by modern life, they consume mindlessly.
They buy things they don't need, they eat food that destroys the soil, they burn energy carelessly just to fill the internal void.
Zen Resort was built to short-circuit that cycle. It is designed to aggressively reconnect the individual with the physical environment, seamlessly integrating modern, data-driven functional medicine with ancient, traditional holistic health practices.
It's a place where guests undergo a profound lifestyle transformation, learning sustainable, mindful practices that they are meant to take back to their own communities.
And he didn't stop at the resort. He partnered with an incredible Brazilian documentary producer named Yuri Sanada to create the Earth Odyssey project.
This is a massive, global, multimedia initiative specifically designed to bypass the politicians entirely and directly mobilize youth, women, and everyday men to force systemic change from the bottom up.
It is beautiful because it all circles back to the very beginning, doesn't it? It circles entirely back to Baraja.
It circles back to his parents and his Jain roots and the concept of ahimsa.
He realized that you simply cannot enforce peace and sustainability from the top down via a 600-page UN document if the individual citizen who is supposed to live by it is violently stressed, consuming mindlessly, and totally disconnected from the earth they walk on.
The micro dictates the macro. The health of the individual cell dictates the health of the entire global body. If you want to heal the earth, you first have to heal the human being.
Precisely. When we step back and look at the incredible arc of Dr. Mahendra Shah's life, it is an absolute masterclass in constantly evolving your tactical approach while fiercely maintaining a core philosophical truth.
He went from a young boy learning deep respect for insects on quiet forest walks in Kenya to a brilliant, hardened data scientist saving millions of lives by turning raw compassion into undeniable logistics during the African famine.
He evolved into the architect of Agenda 21, trying to write the complex mathematical rules for global survival. And finally, recognizing the tragic limits of massive institutions, he became a pioneer of holistic wellness in Bali, returning his focus entirely to the individual soul.
And throughout all of those intense world-shifting phases, his driving force never wavered.
Every single complex spreadsheet he built, every single global policy he fought for in Geneva, every frustrating, ego-driven bureaucracy he navigated, it was all fundamentally driven by his profound love for his family.
It was for his children, Jaideep, Dipali, Rajini, and Kashini, and his grandchildren.
He operated on one absolute core belief. We have inherited this planet from our ancestors while concomitantly borrowing it from our children.
He didn't just write that on a bumper sticker. He lived the crushing weight of that truth every single day.
It is a vital, necessary reminder for all of us today. The global system is deeply flawed, it is often corrupt, and it is agonizingly slow to react to crisis.
But Mahendra's life serves as undeniable proof that relentless, compassionate data combined with individual action can and does move the needle.
When the top-down approach inevitably gridlocks due to ego, the bottom-up approach, the individual commitment to ahimsa, to mindful, sustainable living, becomes our single most powerful tool for survival.
I really want you, listening to this right now, to think about your own life. How often do you feel completely overwhelmed by the state of the world?
It is so easy to open your phone, look at the terrifying climate data, look at the endless political division and war, and just feel paralyzed by how small you are.
But Mahendra believed, with absolute mathematical certainty, that the ultimate power on this planet does not lie in the UN Security Council. It lies in our wallets and our votes.
He believed in the compounding power of the individual.
If modern mindless consumerism is the root engine of climate change and global disparity, as Mahendra argues, then every single individual choice you make matters profoundly.
You are voting for the future of the world with every dollar you spend.
So as we wrap up this journey, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
If we sit around waiting for a UN policy or a corporate mandate to change our habits and save the planet, we might be waiting until it is far too late.
Think about your day-to-day. What is one single modern convenience you engaged with? Maybe a fast fashion item you bought without thinking, a single-use plastic you threw away, or a highly processed meal you ate that might have a hidden, devastating global cost.
Are we just going to wait for someone else in a suit in Geneva to fix it? Or can we start building our own personal zone of tranquility right now in our own lives with our own daily choices?
Can we be the ones to send those grains of rice, even when the world tells us it isn't enough?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves and take care of the world.